basically, I'm going to talk about how I grow uh, ficus in the Rockies. I live in the Rockies too, and I have a climate that is very similar to yours. I live 60 miles from the Canadian border at an elevation of 5,000 feet. And as I mentioned earlier, before we got started officially, um, because of where I live, there's frost possibility every day of the year. So for a number of years, um, I have been growing things mainly in a plant room. So, and I was going to throw out a little bit of caution. I'm going to tell you a lot of things, and we're going to discuss a lot of things. I've been growing my plants solely under lights for over 21 years. So these plants have uh, essentially not seen sunlight except what comes through their windows, which are regular windows. And there's you'll see my room in a minute. I would recommend that you not do things that I recommend, because you can't just take one piece of information that is out there and then use that to try to grow your trees. So be cautious of what I say and what other experts from afar say. So just to give you an idea of who I am, I think Tom's already gone through a ton of stuff about me, but I've been basically growing bonsai indoors and out for 44 years. I've published a lot of articles in major bonsai magazines. I've written 2 books now on ficus, a booklet for the ABS on indoor bonsai, which is still being sold. I've written a major part of the indoor tropical book for the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and I currently am a creator and the moderator of the ficus study group on Facebook, which currently has 35,000 members, which is killing me because I can't believe there's 35,000 people that are interested in growing ficus. But anyhow, these are some of the books that I've written completely or partially. And this is my growing room. And you can see I live at a ski resort, so out the window are ski runs. But the nice part about having a grow room is that my trees, I have access to my trees every day of the year. So I can do everything. When I was growing my temperate trees outdoors here, as with your situation, they have to be winterized and they're not accessible for 6 or 7 months a year and grow very, very slowly. Basically, my trees are growing under artificial light 10 hours a day for day in and day out for the year. The temperatures are 60 to 100 normal temperatures. I have a reverse osmosis water system. I don't control the humidity. And this is an interesting discussion because before I lived in a very dry climate, which you and I now live in, where the humidity is very low, I used to say that if your trees weren't doing well, you needed to increase the humidity. And what I've discovered is that trees do very well in low humidity if all your other growing conditions are good. The humidity is not critical. So even in low humidity, I can grow some very nice trees. I do have, the room has fans that circulate the air, and I fertilize the plants something like once or twice a week, pretty much through the year. And this is a plant room, and you can see the lights hanging down. The roof is opaque. There's no point in having a transparent roof because it's covered in snow for 5 months of the year. So it wouldn't do me any good. So it's just an opaque roof. There's normal windows around the room. And I would estimate that maybe 10% of the light energy that these plants receive is coming through the windows. I would say 90%, my estimate, is coming because of these metal halide grow lights. That's what the lights look like. These are old. These are now 20 years old. So there's there are newer ones that are more efficient, smaller, but anyhow, in the room there are 9 1,000-watt lights going for a 10-hour day. I leave the day length on a clock year round. It's 10 hours. There's fans, small fans that circulate air. That's a reverse osmosis water system, which those of you that care, that water basically has nothing in it. Okay, so that that water is water that we also drink, and what's really fun with that is, have you ever seen the little water, the moisture meters that people use for determining if their bonsai or potted plants need water? Okay, so if you take a cup of reverse osmosis water and you put the water meter in it, guess what it reads? Dry. Because the water meter doesn't measure the water, it measures electrolytic conductivity. And in a solution with no minerals in it, the conductivity is close to 0. So it tells you that this cup of water is dry. So if you're using a moisture meter, be aware of that. And you can see in this picture, that little blue thing on the wall is an automatic pump. So when I water, I can flip that on and it will draw a concentrated solution, fertilizer solution from the bucket down below, suck it up and dilute it to the dilution that I want, and then distribute it to the plants. Okay, just again, in terms of knowing who I am, I've grown several hundred species of figs over the last 44 years. I've also grown many other species of tropical and subtropical trees. So if you have questions later at the end about some other plant, tropical or subtropical, I might be able to help you with that. Okay, this is one of my Ficus microcarpa, and this is one that I imported in 1989 from Taiwan. I always wanted a really nice big trunked fig, and when my second trip to Taiwan in '89, I was able to find this tree and legally imported it into the United States, and it's sitting in my greenhouse. Okay, this is a willow leaf fig, and that's a cover tree of my first ficus book that came out in 2004. And before people come into the greenhouse, I always take out the book and show them the cover of the book. And I say, how big do you think this bonsai tree is? Oh, and they move their hands, you know, maybe a foot apart or 10 inches apart. They go, oh, I think it's about that big. This is actually over 5 feet across. This is an immense tree. Okay. Another species that ficus that I really like and I've worked with is one that's very uncommon, is this Ficus burkii. And this is one of the trees I've created out of that material. These are all cuttings from that mother tree. Many of these are actually root cuttings. So everybody knows you can grow a plant from seed, you can grow it from cuttings of branches, but many people don't realize that many plants, you actually can grow a cutting, a root cutting, and have it sprout. So a lot of the ones you're looking at are actually root cuttings of Ficus burkii. There's another really good species, if you ever get a chance to grow it, Ficus natalensis. Makes just splendid bonsai. Some more of my Ficus natalensis. And So we're talking mainly about figs and plants that are either tropical or subtropical. So we'll show you a few places that I've been and photographed ficus. So this is the ruins of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which have some pretty impressive ficus growing over these ancient ruins. This is from a trip to Hawaii, showing a very nice banyan style ficus. Another large ficus from Hawaii, incredible surface roots. My wife standing in front of the trunk of one of these trees. That is pretty amazing. The tree on top of the rock in the middle ground there is a root over rock ficus, and it's growing 80 feet off the ground with roots descending down the rock face into the ground. There's a Buddha head buried in that morass of ficus roots, again in Thailand. This is on a trip to Australia, in which a fellow bonsai lover took me into the rainforest to show me several of their massive figs, native figs. So this is called the cathedral fig, and you can see the incredible number of roots descending down from the trunk of this tree. If you look carefully, this is South Africa. This is a different species of ficus. You'll see my wife standing behind the root on the right. That is a massive tree. Ficus sur. Here's a Ficus conchina in Thailand, grown by one of my friends. And what makes this remarkable is that this ficus, when it grows new leaves, they come out, depending on the individual plant, quite red, and then they gradually turn into green. So the red only lasts for a week or two, but during that week or two, they are really, really pretty. And of course, Taiwan, which is the home of some just amazing, incredible ficus. I think the best microcarpa ficus in the world are grown in Taiwan. And just for the heck of it, my wife in front of one of the big ficus in Angkor Wat. So you all have the same situation that I do, which is, oh, I'm thinking of growing a ficus, but what do I need to do? Well, one of the issues for you and for me is they are not going to be happy if you get them below 50. So one of the ways of dealing with that is maybe you can grow a ficus, and I've listed 5 that will tolerate some level of cold. I'm not saying you freeze these guys. I'm just saying they're better at dealing with an afternoon of cold or an evening of cold. But if you freeze them, they're probably going to be gone. So those are 5 species, and I'm just going to run through those. So here's me in front of one of the edible figs. That's Ficus carica. And if you go down to the grocery store and you buy some edible figs, this is what I did. And I took the seed out. The inside of the fig, those little crunchy things, are the seeds. I just put them on this, it's kind of like a rock wool, those little cubes you're looking at. So I scattered this, took the seed out of the fig, and lo and behold, I had about 80 of these little ficus trees sprouting. And if you are patient enough, it'll grow up, and you can actually have little figs on, edible figs on your little bonsai carica. And this is a bonsai carica that's not mine. It's by a fellow in Southern California, and he's managed to create, a reasonable bonsai out of Ficus carica. They're not really great at branching, and their leaves are kind of big. But if you forgive that, you can have something that is relatively cold hardy. Carica will take quite a bit of cold. Now I planted some out in my garden out here, and they lived, I think I put 6 plants out in the ground, and each spring there was one more dead one. So after about 5 years, they were all gone. If you want to grow this, you grow it in indoors, you have to remember it will want a cool rest period. Doesn't require a true dormancy like pines or larch or Engelmann or those trees. Those require a cold dormant period. This is not dormancy for this fig. It needs the rest to reset its mechanisms. Okay, now we're in South Africa to look at Ficus Bert Davie, and there's a cliff there, and most of that cliff, growing in front of that cliff, is the Ficus Bert Davie. And this is one that I've been growing for probably 20-something years. It has very small leaves. They actually start out as maybe 3 inches long, but they shrink down with proper care to maybe ½ an inch. And this is a tiny one. You can see my thumb. That's a very small plant. And it's one of the figs that actually has figs. Those are figs on one of my Bert Davie. And believe it or not, if you wait till those figs get purple and you eat one or taste it, it tastes just like an edible fig. The only problem is those little figs are maybe 1/4 of an inch in size. Again, this plant, if you want to grow it well, let it have a cool winter rest. Let it get a little bit dry, and then it does better. Another one that tolerates cold is Ficus sycamora. So this is a massive tree. You can see the car and my friend near it. And this is in South Africa. And these always grow in areas that have water at least part of the year. That's one that I grew in the plant room. And that's one that a friend of mine was growing in South Africa. Very nice tree. Again, this tree will do best if you allow it to get cool and let it dry a little bit. The next one that will do well and cool is Ficus thoningii. And this is a photograph in Southern California. So these guys get really big. And you can see the leaves are pretty large, but they reduce down. So it's no problem shrinking the leaf if you take care of it right. And here's one that's done by a South African friend. And it's actually a fusion of about 4 separate trees. Okay, what happens if you let your ficus get cold? Well, I think you can see what happened there. It got pretty unhappy, and it dropped virtually all its leaves. It did survive, and this is why I tell people, you don't want to let your ficus get near freezing. And well, we'll go into the details. So how can you in the Rockies grow ficus or any kind of subtropical or subtropical? You have to remember, you cannot match outdoor growth. Okay, getting them out in the sun is going to be the best. And indoor growth, it will be necessary because you don't have place. You can't move your trees out in the summer, or you can't put them out at all. So they're always growing indoors. So the issues that we'll run through pretty quickly are light, temperature, soil, water, fertilization. And the trick is, if you really want to grow a plant, one of these ficus or tropical or subtropical, you need to provide them with light, okay? Then the best and cheapest light is outdoors. So that's one approach. The other approach is, if you can't get them outdoors, is you provide accessory illumination, which is what's the best you can do? a bright, bright window, south or west, several hours a day minimum to keep these guys happy. And if you can, artificial lighting, whether it's fluorescent, metal halide, light emitting diodes are the most recent. All of those will produce plants that are actually growing. And as far as temperature, we've discussed that. They kind of need, most ficus need a frost-free environment, ideally above 50. So if you are growing your plants outside in the summer, you're going to wind up moving them indoors because you guys will get a cold day like I get cold days here in the summer. Sometimes we get an alert that we're going to get a frost in June or July or August, which means, well, you've got to either get that tree into indoors if you can. So I think the key thing is determining how you're going to grow these. Are you going to be maintaining them indoors, or are you actually growing them? So if you're just maintaining them, then what you're doing is you bring your trees in for the colder days of the winter. You put them in as much light as you can. You allow them to get quite a bit drier, but not bone dry. Don't fertilize. And basically they don't grow. So they're sitting there, they're just sitting there looking at you. And just to summarize it, the ficus are not dormant, but they are in a rest period when you cool them. And some will do a leaf drop, spontaneously drop leaves. And normally they'll do 20, maybe 30% of the leaves will drop over winter. But you have to remember, some species will actually drop all their leaves. They're not dead. They're just getting ready to grow again as the days lengthen. And the important thing is, if you are bringing the trees in and out for wintering, that when you move a tree out from your house and you put it out, you have to adapt it to sun. You can't take a tree that's been sitting in your house for 5 months in the winter, then stick it in full sun and wonder why the tree is damaged. They will sunburn just like you will. And the same thing happens on the way back in. So in the fall, as it gets cool, you move the tree to more shade and more shade for a couple of weeks. And then when you move it into the house, it doesn't drop all its leaves. So just kind of a little summary right there of whether you're growing them indoors full time, then you have to provide all that light. And if you're wintering indoors, you can go drier and cooler. Again, no fertilizer is necessary if you're just wintering them. And always keep the heavy trimming and the repotting for the growing season, not during your winter season. So just kind of a reminder that although I've been talking specifically about ficus, a lot of this really applies to whatever tropical and subtropical you may be growing. So the care conditions will be very similar. And in a minute or two here, I will stop and then we'll go through questions and thoughts you have about what I've said. Here's advertising for my latest book. And let's see if I can exit.
Jerry, there were a few questions that came in on the chat that I answered briefly, but I'd love to get your thoughts as well.
Absolutely.
One person was asking about LED lighting, and another was asking about RO water and the pH and what you need to do with RO water.
Okay. RO, well, I'll do it in reverse. The RO water, I'm not a big pH. I know there are many people that spend a lot of time and effort to make sure that their pH is exactly right. I have to say, I am not one of those people. However, in growing my plants indoors for many years, I have done measurements on numerous occasions of pH to see what is going on. Why is this plant not doing well? My observation is that a lot of the plants that I have grown, the pH is irrelevant. Okay, that's not to say that it can't be a major factor in why your tree is not doing well. But ficus are not particularly pH sensitive. If you do, what we're all doing is we have a relatively small pot of soil. When we do bonsai, we have a relatively small pot of soil. So if you can, you try to measure the soil pH, which is easier said than done. But anyhow, let's assume you can measure it, okay? And then how long does that pH remain at what you created that lovely soil mixture, and it's a pH of 6.4, say ideal. How long do you think that soil is going to maintain the pH of 6.4? Remember, every day you're pouring water through it. Every day. That soil, when you measure it, is going to have a pH. You know what the pH is? The pH will be the pH of your water, because that's what you've inundated that soil with for a year or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years till you repot it. Now, sure, you put in fertilizer, you do this, you do that. It's going to temporarily change it. But the overwhelming effect is going to be by your water. Whatever your water pH is, over time is going to reflect in your soil. Now, and that's my personal prejudice. Other people would disagree. And I have measured the pH of my water, which is RO water, and it measures neutral to tiny bit acidic. You have to remember, the water has no minerals in it at all, nothing, zero. So what is occurring is carbon dioxide from the air will dissolve itself spontaneously in the water, and that creates carbonic acid. So we'll have a slightly acidic, something like 6.5, 6.7, almost neutral, but it'll be a little bit acidic. And so I haven't really spent time and effort to try to control the pH. If anybody has ideas on controlling pH, I'd be happy to hear how they do it. But I think if you're going to do it effectively, you have to do it by controlling what your water pH is. Now, the other thing is the lighting, and I get into tons and tons of discussions about lighting. And currently, the easiest, most available, and the most publicity is on light emitting diodes, which I have happened to use to some extent over 12 or 14 years. I'm not an expert on LEDs. I can tell you that, and if you go to my website, which is bonsaihunk.us, or you do a search using bonsai hunk and LEDs, you'll show several articles that I wrote years ago. The first article was, I was contacted by a distributor who selling LEDs, grow plant LEDs. And he wanted me to test his LED to prove to me how wonderful they were. Okay. But he wouldn't give me the LED for free. I had to buy it. So I bought this little tiny strip. It was maybe 12 or 14 inches long, and it cost a couple $100. And I set up an experiment where I tested that LED versus some fluorescent lights. And I grew the same plants, same soil, same water, same fertilizer. And the results were that the LED was actually toxic. The plants wouldn't grow under it. They were actually almost dying. So then the fellow said, well, that's because I don't know how to grow plants. I was keeping them too wet. So here's somebody that doesn't know shinola about growing plants and is telling me I don't know how to grow plants. So he said, well, you're keeping them too wet. You have to move the light away. It's too strong. It's too strong. The plants can't take the intensity of light. So I did both those things. I actually moved them away and discovered it didn't make any difference. They still wouldn't grow under that light. And then a few years later, I had another fellow contacted me, and he and his friend were engineers, and they created some LEDs for me to use. And I actually tested them against the fluorescents. And believe it or not, it worked very well. And all they were little circuit boards with little LEDs stuck in them with some electronics. They weren't even in a housing. And anyhow, compared to the fluorescents, I would say they were about the same as what the fluorescents were doing. This is many years ago. And they said, if I told them exactly what frequencies I wanted, they could tailor the light and create a light for me. And I said, well, how much would that light cost? And they said, well, they could probably do it for about $10 for the light. I said, that's great. So let me know when you guys are ready to do some more work. Well, it turns out both of them got jobs and went to grad school and never did get the lights. But to make the story even longer, a few years ago, I had a person show up, a friend of a friend, who saw my plant room and the metal halide lights. And he said, well, it just so happens I actually sell LEDs. I've worked in China for a couple of years with plant LED company. And I am now selling them on my own because they fired me. So here's a guy with experience with LEDs who had spent years in China in the LED industry and specifically plant LEDs. Anyhow, I wound up buying several of his lights. And it turned out they do grow plants very well. The problem is failure rate is astonishingly high. Each light fails about every year and requires a wholesale replacement of the LED modules, which involves soldering and unsoldering and replacing all these LEDs. So I know there are good LEDs out there. I don't mean to say all this that LEDs are not any good. I think they're absolutely excellent, but they can be very costly if you want high power, a lot of intensity, and you want, one of the issues is if you go online and you follow the LED discussions, and these discussions are coming mainly from marijuana growers, they have the most experience with actually growing plants artificially. A lot of the issues with the LEDs are failures and then getting those things repaired because they're virtually all made in China. So who's going to warrant, so you have something that say, oh, well, the life of this LED is 10 years at 10 hours a day. The problem is when it fails, who's going to fix it? Are you going to ship it to China? Because the guy that told you it's going to last isn't in business anymore. So a lot of discussion about LEDs, but I think you have to use a lot of caution. And one of the advantages of LEDs is that what has been said is one of the things that makes LEDs efficient is they tailor the light spectrum to the light energy that plants use for photosynthesis. Okay, so plants that we grow look like what? They look green. Why do they look green? Because they reflect the green light away. They're not absorbing it. So one way to make your lights more efficient for plant growth is don't put in green bulbs. Don't provide them with green spectrum. Well, it turns out in the last few years, that information is erroneous. It turns out they actually do use some of the green. And now the LEDs are coming out and saying, oh, we're putting in green. Oh, and by the way, now we're putting in UV because previously we didn't put UV in. So now all of a sudden we're back to, guess what we're providing? The LEDs now are looking like sunlight. They're not showing tailored spectrum. They're producing white light. So anyhow, too much of your time spent on LEDs. What other questions are out there?
Another one is coming on chat.
What's that?
Another one is coming on chat. So let's see. We've got a variegated ficus under lights, but it's lost its lower leaves. Should they cut it back to regenerate it?
First of all, any variegated plant is weaker than its green counterpart because the green is what photosynthesizes. The yellow and the white generally are performing very little photosynthesis. So if you have two equivalent plants, they're exactly the same leaves, the same size. One is solid green and one has got yellow or white splotching. The variegated one is going to be weaker. And so you're always going to be fighting that, that issue of that plant being a weaker plant. So when you have a plant that's losing leaves on the bottom, it's either not healthy, you're not providing it with really the right conditions, and that can be for any one of whatever causes. It can be improper watering, it can be too low light, it can be, what else? Insects. So there can be lots of reasons why a plant might be losing its lower limbs. So if you think about bonsai in general, okay, not tropicals, but any bonsai, as a bonsai grower, what is your job? How do you grow a bonsai? How do you maintain a bonsai? Your job is to redirect the growth of that tree, right? If you let the tree grow, what it's going to do is it's going to grow at the top, and it's going to, because that's where the light is, and it's going to kill off or stunt the growth of anything that's in the shade or lower down away from the light. So as a bonsai grower, your trick is you have to cut back the parts that are growing too well to let energy go to the parts that are not growing well. Bonsai, that's it. That's the whole trick with bonsai, is redirecting the natural growth of that plant. Because the plant wants to grow in a certain way, and you want it to grow in a different way. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
I certainly think it gives them something to think about.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have questions?
Looks like something came in. How's the soil for bonsai? For ficus different? Okay, so soil is a fascinating subject, and it's one that every single person here who grows plants is going to have a very fixed opinion. What is the best soil? There is no best soil. So let's, I don't want to get too basic, but let's the soil that I use is basically inorganic. So whether, if I had access to decomposed granite like you guys do, a lot of my soil would be decomposed granite. It would be, what other inorganic? My soil is about 90% inorganic. In other words, the soil I have has no nutrition in it. It's basically rocks. So it's lava, DG, pumice, akadama, whatever. And then occasionally, if I feel very, very wonderful, I'll use some small bark chips, but I think the bark chips don't do anything. And so the soil I have is not soil. It's basically ground up rocks. And the key is, since my soil has no organic material, it's not providing any nutrition. No nutrition. I feed my trees. Okay, I'm feeding them once a week. I don't have to rely on the soil decomposing to feed the tree. The soil has to have a certain character. Okay, why does it have to have a certain character? If you grow great tomatoes in your garden and you have this wonderful black soil, right, loam, and you take that great soil that's growing fantastic tomatoes, and you take your bonsai, fig, or whatever, and put your bonsai tree in that black soil, guess what happens? You probably will kill your tree. Why is that? Why, if you take something that's growing great tomatoes and you put it in a pot and it doesn't behave the same? Doesn't behave the same as it does in your garden. Because the soil has to have certain character. Once you put it in a pot, the capacity of that soil or material to hold water and to provide gaseous exchange changes. And it changes by the depth of the soil. The shallower the pot, the worse the problem. So that black soil is going to be a plant killer. And I discovered that many, many years ago. I would do better with pure gravel than I did with the black soil. Now, the main consideration for your soil is the particle size. If your particle size is right, that soil, I use the word soil incorrectly because it's not soil. The particle size determines how wet it stays and how much gaseous exchange occurs. Now, everybody knows the leaves need oxygen. They need gaseous exchange because they do a lot of work. What many people don't realize is that the roots also need moisture, but they are also very dependent on gaseous exchange. A root in water will rot. It dies and it rots. Why? Because gaseous exchange in water in a liquid is 1/10,000th of what it is in gas. So your roots are dying in a water retentive soil. You can make the soil less water retentive by increasing the particle size. The problem is, as your particle size gets bigger, the roots are going to dry out. So gaseous exchange will be great, but the roots will dry out and you lose your tree. So there's now a balance between how fine the particle is how it will retain water, and how it will deal with gaseous exchange. It has to do both things in order for a plant to be happy in it. What I've discovered over the years is the wild card with organic material. What happens with organic material? You make this great bonsai soil, right? It's got bark chips and oak leaf and this and that. All those organic particles, over time, they break down. What happens? They get smaller and smaller. Then they fill all the spaces in the soil. The gaseous exchange goes right down the toilet. The soil stays too wet. So after time, this great bonsai soil that you mix gets less and less and less good because of the organic material breakdown. So what I did over time is I decreased the amount of organic material. Why is the organic material there? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one is it feeds the tree. Well, if you give it plant food, does it need to have organic material? Well, it turns out a lot of trees that I work with don't care whether there's organic or there isn't organic. You feed them, they're fine. So I have basically rocks. The rocks don't disintegrate. They don't turn into smaller rocks. The rock that I put in 2 years ago is still the same rock. It hasn't decomposed like an organic material was. Now, remember when I started, I said, I'm going to tell you a lot of things that you don't change what you're doing based upon what I'm telling you. Just listen to this nonsense that I'm spouting and let it ferment in your head, and maybe do some experimentation. But what I discovered is by going to inorganic materials, my plants did better. I lost less trees. Sorry about that long discussion, but soil is very complex, and everybody's going to have their right own soil mixture.
Yep. Jerry.
Yes.
Jerry, can you talk to us about how you deal with the roots of ficus? One of the things that I have not seen is the ribbon roots that you see on some species of ficus. You tend to see more something that looks like a maple,
Yeah.
that are just a big mass. But how do you get that ribbon root look?
So you're,
or I just haven't seen anybody do it yet.
that's an excellent point. By ribbon root, I'm going to have to clarify. So there are certain ficus, if you look at them in nature, that root will be like a wall. It's at the soil surface, but then it sticks up. It may stick up 8 feet. You could see my wife was standing behind one of those walls of root, and it's fantastic. Some of these trees in nature with these ribbons, or some people will call it buttress, and they naturally form it. But if that's what you're talking about, I have not discovered how to do that in a bonsai. Number one, you have to have a species that is capable of forming aerial roots. So like, for instance, Ficus corica, the edible fig, doesn't form aerials. You could do whatever you want. You're not going to get an aerial. Now, the species that will form aerials, like Microcarpa, you saw a lot of pictures that I showed earlier of Natalensis and Bert Davii, and they will form, they're capable of forming aerial roots, but the formation requires the trunk and branches to stay wet for a period of time. If it stays wet during the growing season, aerial roots will form on those plants. Now, then the question is, what do you do with the aerial roots once you form them? If it dries before they root into the ground, the aerial root dies. So it never forms anything significant. You just see this little thread growing, but it never hits the ground and never roots itself in. So if you get a little aerial root and you want to protect it, you take a straw, you split the straw. Okay, you take a razor blade, slice the straw so it's basically can open. You put the straw up to the aerial, the little teeny root, and you direct the straw to the ground where you want it to. And then every time you water, or twice a day, you put a couple drops of water in the straw. Okay, so then it stays humid. The aerial root grows, roots itself in the ground. After 6 months, you take the straw off. It doesn't need protection anymore. Now, you can do other things with aerials. For instance, one, you can actually root the aerial and grow another tree out of it. That's pretty cool. Or you can take the aerial and actually fuse it onto the trunk to thicken the trunk and create ridges in the trunk, because that root will adhere to the main trunk and form a ridge and then give you a surface root, or nabari, as they say in Japan. And some of the most incredible figs form those tremendous surface roots because they're actually aerials that have fused to the trunk. Did I answer the question, or did I go off on a tangent and not even answer your question?
A little bit on that tangent, but if you're trying to fuse those aerials to the trunk, you need to do something to secure it to the trunk.
Yes.
And to keep it humid as well. And
Yep.
sometimes my experience with natal lenses has been particularly that those aerial roots tend to branch just like the above ground branches do.
Yeah.
And so they become more interesting with time. I'm not sure that I'm doing everything I can to get them to adhere. Sometimes they adhere, sometimes they don't. And again, my experience is with natal lenses.
Okay, so what I do is, if the root is young, it's fragile. So if you try to manipulate it, you're going to break it. So you have to let it get a certain corkiness, a certain thickness, before you can manipulate that aerial. Okay,
Right.
so let's assume you get it thick enough and heavy enough that you can manipulate it. So then I will take a, you know what a cable tie is?
Yes.
So I'll take cable ties and I'll cable it to the trunk. I might put 6 or 8 down the length of the aerial, and that will push. The only reason, well, there's 2 things. If a root, that aerial touches and it stays there, it's going to adhere. But sometimes it just grows and it pushes itself off and it never adheres. It's thick enough and everything. So I take a cable tie and I pull it right up to the trunk. And then I go down an inch and I put another one on. And then I go down another inch. I might have 6 or 8 running down the trunk, pulling that aerial right into the trunk, and it'll fuse in. I have a whole talk on aerial roots and what you can do with them. And it's fantastic. One of the reasons that ficus are just so incredible is that you can use the aerials to actually build the shape of your tree, the trunk and the surface rootage. I mean, it's incredible. But you have to, you could take plastic twine and twine it on there and put that aerial right on the trunk.
Okay.
And it will adhere. I guarantee it. I do it all the time. Almost every day I pull some aerial over to the trunk, or I'll even use it on a branch that needs some thickening. I'll run an aerial down to the branch to get it thicker. you'll never know that that branch was actually composed of an initial branch and an aerial or two that I fused into it. So, and if you email me, I can send you a picture or two of what I do.
Okay.
Now I see some other questions that had come through, but I don't know where they are.
Jerry, I had one. I would love to develop some of those aerial roots, but as far as I know, it has to be really, really high, almost 100% humidity. How do you do it with such low humidity?
Okay, so in my plant room, as I mentioned in the talk, I don't control the humidity, just like you have. Your humidity is low. Even if those aerials, say you got 4 days of rain where you are, which would be highly unusual, you might start the little roots growing, but the next day it's going to be 10% humidity and 90 degrees. They dry up, they're done. So you have to figure out a way, how am I going to keep this plant humid and get these aerials to survive? So there's lots of ways. One, you could baggie the entire tree. Okay, so clear plastic bag, you put the tree in the big, you know, the big bags you get from a dry cleaners. I'll put the whole bloody tree in there. Now, two things you have to be careful of. You now have the tree sealed in a 100% humidity environment. So you, if you keep that up after a week or two, you're going to get fungal issues going on. So that bag has to be opened maybe every 2-3 days for an hour or two, let it dry out, but then reseal the bag. And when you open it, you missed the trunk and the branches, and then you reseal it. You will develop aerials. I've also developed aerials by using sphagnum moss. So in other words, I will pack the trunk and the branches, some of the key branches, with sphagnum moss, and I wrap those areas with plastic and keep that wet. And aerials will grow out of the trunk and out of the branches. And what I do is I nick the branch, nick the trunk, because just keeping it moist sometimes doesn't do it. But if you nick it, it starts it. Now, so you've got an issue with humidity. You have an issue with fungal problems if you keep it sealed. You can also cook the tree because it needs to be in partial shade. You can't put that bag. Now, if you want a way that you can really grow it, I'll tell you how to do it. The best way is you get one of those, I don't know what they call it. You've been at a restaurant in the summer where they have those little nozzles that are spraying water to cool you off, right? Mm. You're outdoors on the patio, but it's 105 degrees in the sun, and they every 15 seconds the lights spray. You buy one of those misters, and I've got it. I bought one at like Home Depot, and I hooked the hose to it in my plant room. Or you could do it on your patio in the summer. Your tree's outside, right? It's doing fine. You put it on a timer, so it goes for 5 seconds every 5 minutes. Okay? You will grow aerials like you can't believe. You'll have aerials all over the bloody thing. Okay? You're gonna have to figure out which ones you're gonna cut off and which ones you're gonna keep. You'll have so many aerials. I did that for about 6 weeks in my plant room. I had aerials and stuff that never had an aerial in 15 years. It's that constant humidity, moisture on the bark. And since the other thing is when you do that, cover the soil so you don't keep the soil saturated. Because when that's going, it's going to really saturate. So you can rot the root system off. So you put a piece of plastic down to keep it from, and you water it normally, lift the plastic and water it normally, but don't let that spray keep inundating the soil, because then you will lose the roots. So that mister is the best way. unbelievable. And I show it in my book. So if you can get a copy of the book, someone will show you, you'll see the setup.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Anybody else have a?
What about, Jerry, what about fertilizer? What kind of fertilizer do you use?
I use something that you're not going to use because it's it's chemical, and since I don't really generally use organics, and I don't have organic materials, I have to provide everything the plants might need. So what I have is basically a complete, what's considered a complete fertilizer. When everybody talks about fertilizer, they talk about NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But there's another 14 elements that plants need, but they need it in those are macronutrients, NPK. But there's micronutrients and there's trace. So there's about 17 chemicals that plants need. So if you're growing inorganically like I am, you have to provide all those. So my fertilizer is a complete fertilizer. It's got everything. And it's also dosed out in a concentration, because you can as you know, you can kill. I've killed a lot of plants with fertilizer. I mean, you overdo the fertilizer, and I've killed like a whole row of pines that I grew for years by just throwing fertilizer around. So if you want to, you can email me. I can tell you what it is, but it's not something that I think you would use, because you have to be careful in how you mix it. And so I actually have a meter that tells me the concentration of how it's being mixed when it comes out of the fertilizer injector. So I know what the plants will tolerate, and when I get above a certain level, then you can see actually plant damage, because you get the fertilizer level too high. So, and of course, the more inorganic your mix, the more dangerous the soil is, the more dangerous the fertilizer is, because as that soil dries, the water disappears, but the chemicals don't. So say you have something that's got a dilution of, I make up a number, 1 to 1,000 of fertilizer in this solution, then the water evaporates, not 1 to 1,000 anymore. It could be 100 to 1,000. It could be 200 to 1,000, depending on how dry you let that soil get. So it's a touchy thing. But if you're interested in the fertilizer, there's nothing magic. Fertilizer is not a magic deal. I used to think that it made a huge difference, and I actually made a huge stride. One of the things when I first did bonsai is I almost never fertilized. I'm talking about outdoor trees. I'm not talking about tropicals. I'm talking outdoors. I would fertilize maybe twice in a growing season. I was very lax about fertilizing. I thought it didn't make any difference. Well, it turns out, fast forward about 10, 12 years, I actually did some experiments, and it turns out I was vastly under fertilizing, which is no surprise because I was only fertilizing like twice a year. And I actually found that my plants, when I increased the fertilization, were growing a lot better, a lot stronger, and I was losing a lot less trees. So I was way on the extreme of under fertilizing. But if you go to the other extreme, and there have been people that have written their whole bonsai career is based upon making up these crazy you know, you use this organic, and then 2 weeks later you use this phosphate, and then 2 days later you get nitrogen, and then you use banana peels, and then you do this and you do that. It's like crazy. I'm not going to do that. I've got a life. I can't be worried about every 3 days doing something else. I need something simple, where I can't kill the trees, but I want to grow them pretty well. So I think those people with crazy formulas for how they fertilize and what, and up and down and this way and that way, that's great. It works for them. There's nothing magic about the fertilizer. It's like, you know, it's like eating and nutrition. You have to eat enough to keep you alive. You eat too much, you get fat like me. You know, then you kill yourself 20 years younger than you should, because you have all these fat-related diseases. But plants are, they're pretty tolerant. You can go vastly one way or quite a bit the other way, but you can kill them. I've killed them with fertilizer easily. So I'm not giving you the answer. Just like I'm not going to tell you a soil mix that's going to work for you.
Mm.
The best thing, if people ask me like, oh, well, you know, what's the best soil? I say, go around to like 6 members of your club that supposedly have good bonsai collection, good trees, okay? And make sure that their trees stay alive. Not that they bought it last week, okay? Look at this beautiful tree I got. I got it last week. Oh, this one I got two months ago. Oh, the one you saw last year is dead. I don't need to know from that person how they're growing their trees. What I wanted to see is somebody who's got a great collection, their trees are healthy, and they're actually growing and they're alive year after year. Then I'm going to pay a lot of attention to that person, how they grow their things, how they water, what their soil is, yada, yada, up and down. You can't change one thing in that whole complex. You alter the water, you alter the fertilizer, you alter the light, you alter the species, you alter how often you water. It all goes out the window. You have to look at the whole package. You can't just separate out one piece and say, oh, listen, Jerry says you don't need fertilizer. He said, hey, you grow it in rocks. And you can. My trees are all growing in rocks. So I'm skirting your issue of fertilizer, because that's another very complex thing. I'm just gonna, just out of interest. So my water is reverse osmosis, so it has nothing in it, right? So I have to provide every nutrient, and I think there's 17 nutrients or chemicals that plants need. Out of the 25 most common fertilizers, do you know how many contain calcium? I went and looked it up. Almost none. You know why? Because most people's water contains calcium.
Mm.
So the nutrient, the fertilizer people don't put calcium in there. Or if they do, it's very little. Well, what if you're somebody like an idiot like me that's doing RO water or is using rainwater? Guess what? There's no calcium. There's no calcium in the water, and there's no calcium in the fertilizer. Then you wonder why your plants don't look right. You just left out one of their major nutrients, is calcium.
So what do you do for that when you deal with that problem,
That's why,
I guess?
well, that's why I had to find a fertilizer that actually contained calcium.
Oh, okay.
So
I see.
the fertilizer I'm using actually has calcium in it. Do you know if your fertilizer contains sulfur? I bet you don't. A lot of sulfur is another element that's needed in very small quantities. It's almost a micronutrient, but they do need it. A lot of fertilizers don't have sulfur.
Doesn't sulfur come in rainwater though? I mean, I would think that collects through the atmosphere as well in some way.
Yeah, but you're depending on which way the wind is blowing and how much industrial pollution is in your air. You have very clean air where you live. I have very clean air here. So you're relying on nature to maybe blow some sulfur your way. So anyhow, it's worth looking into. And I've spent a lot of time when I've had issues trying to figure out, like, what is the problem? And one of the investigations was investigating fertilizers. It's very interesting if you actually look at what's contained in there. It's not every nutrient is in that fertilizer, I assure you. And yet plants need it. Any other questions? Paul, do you have any more that's stacked up?
Not that I'm seeing. I think there was a question about amount of lights for the variegated ficus, if it needed less or more.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. If you put a variegate in super bright light, which means Denver level sunshine, you're going to burn the leaves. They burn. You'll see brown spots. They are not capable, because they don't have the normal amount of pigments. They will burn very easily. So generally, they don't want to be in full sun. They want to be like in some partial. Now you remember, the more shade you give them, the less photons they get, right? The less sun. And of course, all of you realize this, but plant food is not food. Okay, we eat food. As humans and as an mammals, we can't synthesize the elements that we need. We have to eat the fats and proteins. We can't make it. We have to eat something else. We have to eat that and then break it apart and then resynthesize it to give us fats and proteins and essential chemicals that we need to survive. Plants, on the other hand, can't deal with that. They synthesize everything that they need from minerals. So you have to provide them with minerals. The plant food, their source of energy is sunlight. And a lot of people think, oh, the food is what's feeding the plant. See, they're growing up. No, food is what feeds us. That's why we develop our muscles and fat and all that stuff. But plants don't need it. They need sunlight. Problem with the variegates is they are damaged by too much light. And yet, if you put them in dim light, they don't synthesize enough. So they're weak. Plus, I stopped growing variegates. You know why? They're very attractive. Because people go like, oh, that's really pretty. Look at all the yellow and stuff on that, okay? That's one person out of 100, right? Or two people. The other 40 people out of 100 go, your plant's sick. See all that yellow on it? That's sick. I go, no, it's not sick. It's a variegate. They'd go, oh, sure. Like, you lying dog. So I got tired of it. I said, okay, they're very attractive, but I'm not growing variegates. Forget it.
There was Jerry, there was a question in the chat about defoliation or partial defoliation or whatever.
Yeah.
Something you can talk about for a minute?
Okay, so one of the critical factors in bonsai is that most of us, for most of our creations, are making a creation that is meant to look like a tree, like a real full-size tree.
Right.
Now, there's a whole other classification of the art form of bonsai, or a lot of other art forms, where the artist has no intention of creating a realistic tree. They want to create something that has flow or line or movement or an expression, or they want it to look like an elephant, or they want it to look like a torpedo, or whatever. So they are not producing, the art is you're either producing a realistic tree or you're using the tree as like you'd use clay to form something, okay? And people are there are two schools. They either want it to look like a tree or they want it to look like something that's not tree-like but expresses emotion. Anyhow, if you want your bonsai to be tree-like, one of the concept to get you to believe that this little 1 foot high tree is actually a 40-foot high tree is the scale. And the scale is how big are the leaves. If the leaves are really tiny, all of a sudden this thing comes into like, oh wow, that really looks like a tree. The bigger the leaves are, the less it looks like a real tree. It begins to look like, well, it's a small plant, but I don't know that it looks like a tree because the leaves ruin the image. So one of the goals is to get the leaves, if you want to do a realistic tree, as small as you can get them. Now, you can get a miniature leaf tree. So you have a maple, full maple leaf is 8 inches across, or you can get a maple that genetically has small leaves. Well, then you're ahead of the game. You got a tree that's got small leaves, it's already going to be more believable. Or you're growing a tree that's like I do. Many of the ficus, the leaves are big, they're large. How do you make a bonsai that's going to be believable? Well, if it's a big leaf, you could grow a bigger tree. Then the scale is okay. But what if you don't have space for a tree that's 6 feet across? You have to have something that's this big, 12, 14 inches. That means that leaf needs to be, maybe an inch or smaller for that scale to look right. So one of the techniques that people have discovered over the years is on a lot of trees, you can remove the leaves from your tree. Okay, so you cut them off, cut all the leaves off. If the tree is healthy and you haven't messed up, the tree will grow new leaves. And the new leaves, that's called defoliation. And the new leaves that grow in, if you've done it properly, will, believe it or not, come in much smaller. They're not permanently small leaves, because if you look at a stem, after you take all the leaves off, the first leaf grows very small. The next leaf is a little bit bigger. The next leaf is bigger until about the 6th or 7th leaf, when, guess what? That 7th leaf is now the genetically determined full-sized leaf. So what you do is you have a healthy tree, you want it to look right, you want to take a beautiful picture, you want to take it to the show. You take off all the leaves, you time it just right, so it's just grown 3 leaves on each little spot. Now the leaves are all small, the scale is right, you take a picture of it, you send it to the magazine, they put your tree on the cover, you take it to the show, you win first prize in the show, everybody goes like, man, how'd you get the leaves so small on that? That's really great. Well, it's a trick. The problem is, I get a question like that every single day by people that want their tree to look good. They want those little leaves and they want to know how to do it. So if you Google my name and defoliation, you'll find an article that tells you how to do it. The problem is when I ask that person, send me a picture of the tree that you want to make small leaves. And they send me this pathetic little tree that has 5 leaves on it. It's sitting in a window in New Orleans in an office building and is barely alive. And it's got 5 pretty big leaves on it. The last thing in the universe that person needs to do is to take those leaves off that tree, because that will be the end of it. It's done. It will has no reserves to grow small leaves. It's barely alive. And yet the beginner wants it to look right. They want those small leaves. So they've read about defoliation. How do I do that? So it's a great technique, but it's not for beginners. You need to know how to do it, when to do it, and when not to do it, because you can finish your tree off or lose branches, or, you know, it's like everything else. You need to know what you're doing. Anybody else?
Jerry, could you address pest control problems you have and how you treat them?
Oh my God, pest control is
Without going all night.
a nightmare. And the reason is that my plants are growing in a extremely restricted environment. So when I introduce a plant, so somebody says, oh, you know, you've been looking for, you know, Ficus conchina, and I have one that's like absolutely fantastic. You have to have it. So I get it, and I look at it, and it looks great. But like a month later, I discover that bloody thing has pests all over it that I did not see. Okay. They go rampant in my plant room because my plant room doesn't get hot. It doesn't get cold. It doesn't get windy. It doesn't get too sunny. It doesn't get, it's perfect, and no predators. A single insect goes ballistic, and it is impossible when you have several hundred plants that are full of leaves and little crooks and crannies, and to get rid of them. So you need, you know, and I can tell you pests have been a huge problem for me, a huge problem. In fact, the last time I was in Denver doing programs, I spent quite a bit of time at the Botanic Garden talking to their pest experts, because I had an issue with a pest that most people are unaware of. It's called Western flower thrip. I don't think anybody here probably has heard of it. It's probably the most common destructive pests in the flower plant industry and foliage industry. And it's all over the world. All over the world. And it has been transmitted and carried everywhere. And the bug is resistant to everything. You can spray it with malathion, you can spray it with whatever you want. You are not going to kill that bug. You may knock it down, but in 6 weeks, they're back in full force. And I'd battle that for 2 years, 3 years, before I found something that I could treat it with. I finally got rid of that bug. So do you have something specific that you're after, or?
Well, I have, for instance, I'm sure a lot of us have things like mealybugs in the winter. My bugs certainly get better when I put them out, you know, when I put my trees outside,
Right.
my indoors, because I do have predators. But anything in particular you use indoors, winter, or?
Okay,
like
so
mealybugs, so
for what I consider the treatable bugs, which are mealybugs, aphids, scale,
that kind of thing.
I use Bayer tree and shrub. Okay, and that is a systemic. So you do a drench with it to the root system, and the plant sucks it up, and the plant itself is toxic. So anything that's sucking or chewing on it is not going to be happy. And in general, that has worked really well for those insects. Now, it did not do anything for Western flower thrip. Nothing. Nothing. You could, and that treatment is supposedly a yearly treatment. So here's the typical story I get. Someone says, so I have a plant that's a bug magnet. I go, what do you mean? Of course, I know now because I've gotten a million of these. Well, you know, I had scale on it, And I did this, I treated it with neem oil, I treated it with this, I treated it with that, I sprayed it, I used alcohol, I did this, I used some soap, and then I got rid of them, and then I brought the tree in the house for the winter, and sure enough, in 6 weeks, the tree's back with all the scale. The tree's a magnet. It just sucks. It sucks insects from the atmosphere. They just find it, and this happens time after time after time. They never get. The problem is, it's not a magnet. They never got rid of the bug. They never got rid of the scale. They never got rid of the white fly, because the treatment that they're doing is ineffective. It knocks the bulk of the insects down, but it doesn't get rid of the eggs or the larvae, or the ones that are in the soil, or the ones that are in a crease in the bark, or the one that's underneath the leaf, or it's in the bud. And it's not the tree's fault, it's the owner's fault. The owner never got rid of the bug. So they are using an ineffective treatment because people don't want to, and I understand they don't want to use harmful chemicals that can harm them. They can harm the kids, they can harm their pets. But with bonsai, it's really difficult because, you know, you spend 8 or 10 years developing something, and if you lose a branch, that's a lot of effort. I can't necessarily regrow that branch in my lifetime. So, you know, getting an insect infestation, they go like, oh, I don't care. It's got some bugs on it. They come, they go. You know, I lose a little branch here or a branch there, but that's okay. But you have a significant tree and you lose a piece of it as a bonsai, it's you put a lot of years in there. So I have a little less tolerant attitude about when I see a bug, and also because I've like, at least your trees go out. If you can put them out, then the wind, the sun, the rain hits it. There's a million things going on that suppress the bugs. But if you're growing strictly indoors in a controlled environment, there's nothing to inhibit the bug. So I get a lot more paranoid about things that I can't take care of and that are actually hurting my plants. So bay tree and shrub is very good for the insects you mentioned. I have treatment for Western flower thrip. If you get one that I dealt with for years was the spider mite. I don't know if you guys have spider mites where you are. I get them. I mean, I don't get them, but the plants get them. And you know when they get them? They get them, the plants are infected about October. Early fall. Why is that? Well, I thought because I could never exterminate the mites, the spider mite, because I was spraying and I'd get rid of them, but then came the fall and here they are again. And the plants don't go outside. Well, it turns out after many years of fiddling around, the issue is the spider mites come in through the ventilators. The plant room gets warm in the summer, so it's sucking in cool outdoor air and blowing it all over my plants. Well, it turns out the spider mites are outside. My plants were reinfected every fall because all summer long, the ventilators are pulling spider mite laden air and blowing it all over my trees. So I discovered that by getting a very good miticide and doing one treatment in the fall, I don't have an issue with spider mites, but you need an effective treatment, which is, I can give you the name of it if you, anybody has a spider mite issue. So bugs for me are a big deal and get me crazy. I'm crazy anyhow, but they make me crazier. Anybody else have a indoor growing? Or I also grow out, I mean, I grew outdoor plants for 30 years, so I've got some pretty good ideas about growing your other trees too. if you have any issues. Sounds like it may be time to go home, or you are home. You don't have to go home.
Thank you so much for your time, Jerry. This has been great. Answered tons of questions.
Yeah. Thanks guys for having me back. It was a blast.